Chapter 20. The Great Escape, Part 4. The engine hummed softly in the dim silence of the night. Inside the van, Thomas glanced back over his shoulder, checking on Mina and Lucas. They were curled on makeshift mattresses on the floor, silent except for Lucas's deep, even snores. Mina mumbled something unintelligible, twisting slightly as she dreamed. Her forehead glistened with sweat, and the shadows beneath her eyes were stark reminders of the toll this escape had taken. Beside him, the researcher gripped the steering wheel, his eyes bloodshot and fatigued. They had been weaving through dark alleys and quiet streets for hours, keeping to the most reclusive parts of the city, always northbound. The researcher seemed to sense every twist and turn, maneuvering through the maze of narrow streets like he'd memorized the path long ago. "Just a few more blocks," Thomas muttered, mostly to himself. But it was enough to spur the researcher to nod, as if the words were a lifeline keeping him alert. But the strain showed in the faint shake of his hands, the slight lag in his reactions. "We should be close to the edge," Thomas said, his voice low. "Soon you'll get your rest. Just stay awake a bit longer." The researcher grunted, barely acknowledging him. Thomas frowned, his gaze sharpening as they turned onto a broader road, lined with derelict buildings and empty lots. The streets had grown quieter, almost eerily so. There were no streetlights here, just the van's pale beams stretching down the dark path ahead. Up ahead, the road stretched westward, empty and unguarded. The first real break they'd caught tonight. "No patrols," Thomas murmured. "Keep steady and take it slow." The researcher exhaled, his grip loosening slightly as they followed the road. Soon, the rugged old path beneath them began to rattle the van as it bumped along the uneven surface, but the quiet was welcome. No wailing sirens, no flashing lights. Only the dark countryside around them, stretching wide and empty. Minutes turned into half an hour, and Thomas watched as exhaustion began to wear further on the researcher. His eyes grew heavier, and he blinked slower, his shoulders sagging with the effort to stay focused. "We need to make it past the next town," Thomas said, voice sharper now. "Stay with me." The researcher nodded sluggishly, muttering, I'm fine." But his voice wavered, barely convincing. As they rolled into the small town ahead, it felt almost too quiet, a slumbering settlement under the veil of night. They slipped through the empty streets unnoticed, no lights flickering on in the surrounding houses, no curious glances following their van. When they cleared the last row of houses, Thomas felt the weight of tension ease, if only slightly. But the researcher was nearing his limit. His breathing had slowed, and his head dipped momentarily before he jerked awake. Thomas weighed their options as he scanned the road ahead. They could risk stopping for a few minutes, but they'd have to find somewhere remote, where they wouldn't be spotted. Thomas was just about to tell the researcher to take the next side road when a soft groan escaped his companion's lips. "Pull over," Thomas ordered. The researcher barely managed to steer the van onto a gravel path, hidden behind a row of trees, before he let out a long, ragged sigh, allowing himself a moment's reprieve. They climbed out of the van, stretching stiff limbs and breathing in the cool night air. Houses dotted the landscape around them, each set far apart, their lights dark, leaving only the faint shapes of roofs and porches in the moonlight. It was quiet here, quiet enough to feel like they had finally slipped under the Empire's radar. But the peace didn't last. A faint hum pierced the silence, growing louder by the second. Thomas's instincts flared, and he spun toward the van, his senses on high alert. Shapes moved in the shadows around them, sleek and metallic, gliding silently across the ground. A swarm of security drones and pods emerged from the darkness, circling them. "Get back!" Thomas hissed to the researcher, who froze, his eyes wide as the realization hit him. The drones hovered closer, casting beams of light that swept across their faces. Before Thomas could react, a pair of officers stepped out from behind a pod, their stunners aimed squarely at them. "Face down, both of you," one of the officers commanded, his tone cold and final. Thomas glanced at the researcher, whose face had gone pale, eyes darting between the stunners and the ground. Panic flickered across his expression, and before Thomas could say anything, a blast from the stunner hit the researcher squarely in the chest. He crumpled to the ground, motionless. Thomas's mind raced. He had no intention of surrendering. With quick, decisive movements, he grabbed the paralyzed researcher by the collar, heaving him up and dragging him toward the van. Bullets wouldn't come. These officers needed them alive, but the drones swarmed closer, trapping them in a tightening circle. Thomas threw the researcher into the back, then scrambled into the driver's seat. He gripped the wheel, heart pounding as the drones closed in, their lights blinding. He'd never driven before, not in any official capacity, but he'd watched the researcher closely enough to know the basics. Thomas pressed down on the accelerator, lurching the van forward with a jolt. The tires screeched against the gravel, and the van shot out of the circle of drones, barreling down the narrow road. Branches scraped against the sides as he veered off-road, nearly skidding into a tree before he regained control. The drones were right behind them, their lights casting eerie shadows that flickered across the van's interior. He gritted his teeth, swerving to avoid another tree, barely keeping the van steady on the bumpy terrain. The path was tight and winding, with no clear end in sight, but he had no choice except to keep driving. The shadows of a sprawling ranch came into view up ahead, its buildings nestled at the end of the road. Thomas pushed the van harder, desperation lending him focus as he drove toward the faint outline of a barn beside the main house. He twisted the wheel just as the van shuddered to a halt, colliding with the corner of the barn. The impact jolted him forward, rattling his teeth, but he ignored the pain. The researcher stirred beside him, groggy but waking. As his eyes registered their surroundings and the approaching drones, panic replaced his grogginess. What are you doing?" he stammered, his voice trembling as he tried to pull himself upright. Thomas barely glanced at him. "Buying us time. You're going to stay here and keep them busy." The researcher's eyes widened and he reached out, grabbing Thomas's arm. "They'll kill me." Thomas met his gaze, unyielding. "Maybe stun you again at worst. Besides, you're the one they're looking for. Officially kidnapped and all that. Nothing to hide, right?" The sarcasm in his voice was pointed, but he didn't wait for the researcher's response. Thomas threw open the back doors and moved to where Mina and Lucas lay, oblivious to the chaos around them. He heaved Lucas onto his shoulder, grunting as he shifted his weight, then did the same with Mina, positioning her over his other shoulder. The weight was crushing, but adrenaline sharpened his focus as he glanced back at the researcher one last time. "Stay here. Do what you can to delay them," he said flatly, then slipped out the back, the weight of his friends bearing down on him with each step. Thomas moved swiftly, heading toward the cornfields that stretched beyond the ranch. The tall stalks offered some cover, swaying gently in the breeze that had picked up, and he slipped into the dense rows, his steps careful but quick. Behind him, he heard the faint thrum of engines and the shouts of officers as they descended on the van, voices echoing through the night. A flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a distant rumble of thunder. A storm was rolling in from the northwest, dark clouds gathering ominously on the horizon. The wind grew stronger, rustling the cornfields around them, masking the sound of his hurried footsteps. Each step felt like a small victory as he made his way deeper into the field, the distant wail of sirens receding into the background. He glanced back once, watching as lights flickered near the ranch, then shifted his focus forward, pushing himself to keep moving, to keep going, to escape. The weight of his friends was heavy, the ground uneven, but he pressed on, driven by a fierce determination.